Hey there, sleepy wasteland wanderers. Tonight, we're diving into the haunting beauty of the Fallout universe, where broken cities whisper forgotten stories, and every shadow hides a tale of survival. I'll be your guide through these glowing ruins, sharing quiet moments of hope, resilience, and the eerie calm of a world long gone. Why the pre-war world was worse than the wasteland. Welcome, wanderer, to the world that ended. Not the wasteland, which you know already in its bones and its radiation and its long, patient silence. Tonight we go further back, to the place the wasteland came from, to the civilization that built the terminals and the vaults and the cheerful robots and the nuclear-powered cars, and then built, with the same institutions and the same corporate apparatus and the same government that smiled reassuringly from every information film, the conditions for its own complete destruction. So settle in now, let your breathing slow, and let the brightness find you across the distance of 2 centuries, warm and artificial, and absolutely convinced of its own permanence. We are going to look at it carefully. We are going to look at what it was made of, and what it cost, and who paid, and who collected, at the wonders it produced, and the crimes it required, and the specific quality of the willful blindness it cultivated in the people who lived within it. We are going to look at it honestly, which is to say, more honestly than it ever looked at itself. The bombs have not yet fallen. The Nuka-Cola machine is still humming in the corner. The Vault Boy is still smiling from the poster on the wall, thumb raised, face round and bright, and completely certain that everything is going to be fine. Close your eyes if you are ready, and let us begin at the beginning, in the light, before the light ended. There is a grief that the wasteland carries for a world it never knew, a mourning built into every rusted billboard and every crumbling overpass, every Nuka-Cola machine still humming in the ruins of a diner where no one will ever sit again. The survivors and their children learned to mourn that lost civilization as something golden, something worth recovering, the dream deferred by fire. But settle in now, close your eyes, and let us look more carefully at what actually stood before the bombs fell. What we find there is not a golden age. What we find is something that deserved, perhaps, more honesty than it ever allowed itself. Before the fire came, there was the light. And the light was blinding in the particular way that only a very deliberate brightness can be. Walk through any American city in the years approaching 2077, and what you would see was a civilization that had mastered the art of surface, that had refined the performance of prosperity into something so complete and so carefully maintained that the performance had long since replaced whatever truth it was originally meant to represent. The advertisements were everywhere, towering above the streets in colors that belonged to another era, cheerful and rounded and warm in the aesthetic of a 1950s dream that America had decided, sometime in the middle of the century, it would simply never relinquish. The future had arrived, and it had arrived looking exactly like the past, atomic-powered and chrome-trimmed, and smiling its wide corporate smile at everyone who passed beneath it. Nuka-Cola refreshed the nation on every corner, its bottles a familiar weight in hands that had been reaching for them since childhood. The formula unchanged and the branding unchanging in a world where everything else was quietly, desperately accelerating towards some terminus that polite conversation did not acknowledge. Mr. Handy units floated through domestic spaces, doing the work that servants had once done. Their cheerful British effect, a design choice someone had made decades ago, and no one had ever revisited because it still sold units, still communicated a certain idea about what comfort looked like when it was automated and nuclear-powered and humming with the energy of a miniaturized star. The cars that filled the highways ran on atomic cores, and they were enormous, finned and gleaming, and when they crashed badly enough, they detonated with the force of small bombs, which was a fact that everyone understood on some level and that no one discussed at dinner. The Institute of Technology and its counterparts produced innovations at a rate that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations. robotics and energy technology, and agricultural science and medical research, all advancing in tandem, all promising a future of abundance and ease that was always described as arriving soon, always positioned just ahead of the current moment, like a horizon that moved as you walked toward it. The advertisements said you deserved this. The radio said you had earned it. The government films said that America was the greatest civilization in human history and that its citizens, through the simple act of being American, participated in that greatness and shared in its rewards. The films were bright and the music was cheerful, and the actors smiled the way people smile when they have been directed to smile and are thinking about their lunch. Beneath the brightness, the machinery that produced it was grinding against itself in ways that the brightness was specifically designed to prevent anyone from noticing. The resource wars had been building for nearly 30 years by the time the bombs fell. The world's petroleum reserves collapsing in the mid-21st century in ways that economists had predicted and politicians had chosen not to address while addressing was still possible. The American economy had been quietly restructuring itself around scarcity for decades. The corporations that produced the cheerful advertisements and the atomic-powered luxuries, consolidating their control over the essential systems of daily life in ways that governments found convenient to permit and citizens found difficult to perceive. When a single company controls your energy, your food supply, your communications infrastructure, and the automated systems that process your financial transactions, the question of who actually governs your life becomes interesting in ways that the government's civic education materials did not explore. The poverty that accompanied this consolidation was not hidden exactly, but it was framed, managed, narrated in ways that transformed systemic failure into individual failing, that explained the tent cities appearing at the edges of major American cities as the consequence of personal choices made by people who lacked the discipline or the intelligence to participate fully in the prosperity that surrounded them. The propaganda posters celebrated the American worker with one hand, while the corporations that produced those workers' livelihoods automated their jobs with the other. Robco's automated labor systems displacing entire employment sectors in the name of efficiency, while the displaced workers were encouraged to retrain, to adapt, to demonstrate the resilience and ingenuity that were the hallmarks of the American character. The retraining programs were inadequately funded. The ingenuity was not rewarded. The resilience was simply expected and then consumed without acknowledgement. What made this particular civilization so remarkable in its dishonesty was the sincerity of the performance, the genuine belief that many of its participants held in the dream they were enacting. The middle-class family in their suburban home with their Mr. Handy and their Nuka-Cola and their fallout shelter kit from the government preparedness program had not necessarily chosen deception consciously. They had been formed by an aesthetic and an ideology so totalizing that the difference between believing the performance and performing the belief had ceased to be meaningful. The child who grew up watching government educational films about the wonders of atomic energy and the importance of American values was not being cynical when they reported suspicious neighbors to the authorities or expressed support for the annexation of Canada. They were enacting the identity they had been given, wearing the brightness that had been fitted to them since birth, and if something beneath that brightness felt wrong, they had been provided no vocabulary with which to name the wrongness. The vaults themselves were perhaps the purest expression of this dynamic, the most complete symbol of what the pre-war world actually was beneath its cheerful surface. Vault-Tec advertised its shelters as the government's gift to the American people, the assurance that civilization would survive whatever came, that the investment America had made in its citizens would be protected against the worst possibilities. The posters showed smiling families descending into clean white corridors, children clutching stuffed animals, parents confident in the knowledge that they had done what was necessary to ensure their children's future. Vault-Tec's marketing department understood human fear and human hope with extraordinary precision. and it deployed that understanding in service of a product that was not what it claimed to be, in service of a purpose that its customers were never permitted to know. The pre-war world had learned to monetize hope so efficiently that the monetization had become invisible, had become simply the texture of daily life, the water in which everyone swam. You purchased your preparedness kit and felt prepared. You bought your Nuka-Cola and felt refreshed. You watched your government films and felt patriotic. You reported your suspicious neighbor and felt civic. The loop was closed and the light continued, steady and warm and completely artificial, burning on the energy of resources that were running out, sustained by a confidence that was being manufactured rather than earned, spreading its cheer across a continent that was quietly preparing for catastrophe, while loudly insisting that catastrophe was impossible because America had never allowed it before. The people who designed the brightness were not all cynical. That is worth understanding, worth sitting with in the dark before sleep takes you. Some of them believed in it genuinely. The executives who approved the cheerful advertisements, and the government officials who signed the propaganda budgets, and the scientists who took the military contracts and told themselves the research would benefit humanity. Eventually, the pre-war world did not fail because it was populated by villains. It failed because its systems had been designed to reward certain kinds of blindness, to make willful ignorance the most comfortable option, to ensure that the people in positions to change things had the least motivation to look carefully at what needed changing. The brightness was a consensus, sustained by everyone who benefited from not examining it too closely. And there were genuine wonders in it, genuine achievements that the ruins preserve in amber for wastelanders to find and marvel at. The technology was extraordinary by any prior measure, the medicine capable of things that would have seemed miraculous to earlier generations. The agricultural science and the engineering and the sheer productive capacity of the pre-war industrial system representing peaks of human capability that the wasteland has not yet approached and may not approach again for generations. The tragedy of the pre-war world was not that it had built nothing worth keeping. It was that what it had built was inseparable from what it had concealed, that the wonders and the crimes shared the same foundations, that you could not preserve the Nuka-Cola and discard the exploitation that produced it, could not save the Institute of Technology's medical research and leave behind the military applications that funded it. The wasteland that replaced this brightness is brutal in ways that no careful language can soften. People die of thirst and radiation and violence in the wasteland in ways that no one in a pre-war suburb ever had to fear. The absence of the infrastructure that sustained pre-war comfort is a genuine deprivation, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise, to romanticize the ruins without acknowledging what was lost in them. But the wasteland does not lie to you about what it is. The danger is visible, the violence is direct, the hunger is real, and acknowledged rather than explained away as the consequence of inadequate personal ambition. The community you find in the wasteland was chosen rather than inherited, built by people who knew what they were building and why, held together by genuine need rather than marketing demographics. There is something in that honesty, something that the brightness of the pre-war world, for all its warmth and all its wonder, was never quite able to provide. The performance was extraordinary, but it was always a performance, and eventually, as all performances must, it ended. The wars that ended the world did not begin on the 23rd of October, 2077, when the missiles crossed their arcs above the atmosphere and descended into the cities and the silos and the soft places where people had gathered to live their ordinary lives. The wars that ended the world began much earlier and much more quietly, in the ledgers of petroleum companies and the briefing rooms of government ministries, and the slow, grinding recognition, spreading through the middle decades of the 21st century like water through cracked concrete, that the resources upon which industrial civilization had been built for over 100 years were running out, and that the mechanisms which might have managed that depletion peacefully had been systematically dismantled or never built at all. The resource wars, as history would eventually name them, lasted from approximately 2052 to 2077. a quarter century of escalating conflict that consumed nations and peoples and entire ways of life with an appetite that matched and finally exceeded anything the world's petroleum reserves had ever managed. They were not one war but many, not one cause but dozens. Their common thread, the simple and terrible fact that the modern world required more of certain things than the earth contained, and that no civilization had been wise enough or humble enough or far-sighted enough to address that fact before it became a crisis. The petroleum collapse came first in the public consciousness, though economists and geologists and a small number of honest government officials had been marking its approach for decades before it arrived. The oil fields of the Middle East, which had sustained the global economy through the second half of the 20th century and the early decades of the 21st, began their terminal decline with a speed that surprised even those who had predicted it, the reserves proving smaller than the producing nations had officially reported, the extraction rates that had seemed sustainable, revealing themselves as anything but. The price of fuel rose in ways that were initially explained as temporary disruptions, market fluctuations, the consequence of political instability in producing regions that would resolve itself once order was restored. Order was not restored. The prices continued to rise. The disruptions did not resolve. The instability that was described as the cause of the economic pain was itself a symptom of the same underlying depletion. Nations whose entire social contracts had been built on petroleum revenues, discovering that those revenues were diminishing in ways that could not be reversed. Populations who had been promised prosperity by governments that could no longer deliver it, finding other things to promise them instead. The European Commonwealth fractured under the pressure with a speed that observers described as shocking, and that was, in retrospect, entirely predictable. The political project of European unity had always been more fragile than its architects admitted, its foundations in shared economic interest rather than shared identity or genuine solidarity. And when the economic interest began to diverge as resource scarcity created winners and losers, even among allied nations, the solidarity dissolved faster than the institutions designed to maintain it could respond. Member states began competing rather than cooperating for the remaining petroleum reserves. Bilateral deals, struck in secret contradicting multilateral agreements, signed in public, the machinery of collective decision-making, seizing up as individual governments, concluded that their first obligation was to their own populations, and that their allied neighbors would have to manage their own resource panic without assistance. By 2052, the Commonwealth had effectively ceased to function as a unified entity, and the wars that replaced its diplomacy were small at first, border disputes and trade route conflicts, the kind of violence that serious analysts described as limited and manageable, and that the people who died in it experienced as simply catastrophic. The Middle Eastern conflicts of the same period were described by the American government and its media apparatus as a humanitarian intervention, an effort to stabilize a region whose instability threatened global economic recovery. The language of assistance and partnership draped over operations whose actual purpose was securing access to whatever petroleum reserves remained extractable from fields that were already in decline. American soldiers died in deserts for resources that were running out regardless of who controlled the territory above them. The strategic calculus of the intervention, based on projections that were optimistic even when they were written, and that the events of subsequent years proved to be fictions. The people who lived in those territories experienced the intervention in ways that the American government's communications apparatus did not transmit back to American citizens. The distinction between stabilization and occupation being one that depended entirely on which side of the equation you occupied. China's crisis was of a different character, but the same underlying cause. A nation of more than 1 billion people whose industrial modernization in the late 20th and early 21st centuries had created economic growth rates that the ruling party's legitimacy depended upon. Discovering that the resource base required to sustain that growth was either depleted or controlled by nations with no reason to sell it at prices that made Chinese industrial production competitive. The famines that followed the resource contraction were not the sudden dramatic famines of earlier centuries, but a slow, grinding nutritional decline, food becoming more expensive faster than wages rose, protein disappearing from diets that had only recently begun to contain it regularly, the agricultural system that fed more than 1 billion people, revealing its dependence on petroleum-derived fertilizers and petroleum-powered machinery in ways that the declining fuel supply made horribly legible. The Chinese government's decision to resolve this crisis through expansion into Alaska, reframed as the reclamation of territories historically belonging to the Chinese sphere of influence, was the decision of a government that had exhausted its other options and understood that its survival depended on acquiring resources that it could not purchase. The Sino-American War, that began in 2066 and continued until the bombs fell, would consume 11 years and an uncounted number of lives on both sides, fought in the frozen wilderness of Alaska and in the jungles and rice paddies of ancillary theaters, and eventually, through the submarine campaigns and the resource blockades, across the entire Pacific. American soldiers at Anchorage experienced a conflict that the government films and the radio broadcasts described as a noble defense of American territory against communist aggression, and that the soldiers themselves, in the letters and the recordings they left behind, described in terms considerably more complicated the experience of killing and being killed in a landscape that offered no comfort and no clarity, for objectives that were described in political language that bore no apparent relationship to the specific ground they were asked to hold or take. The liberation of Anchorage in 2077 was presented as a triumph of American military capability and a vindication of American values, and it was those things, and it was also the consequence of a power armor assault that killed an enormous number of people, and the soldiers who participated in it carried both of those truths simultaneously in ways that the victory celebrations did not accommodate. Canada did not choose to be part of this war. That is perhaps the simplest and most important thing to understand about the annexation, that it was not a negotiation or an agreement or even a conquest in the traditional sense, but something more mundane and more terrible, a bureaucratic decision made by people in Washington who had concluded that Canada's resources, its oil sands and its fresh water and its territory and its industrial infrastructure were required for the American war effort, and that the most efficient way to acquire them was simply to declare Canada part of America and then deal with the objections as they arose. The objections arose. Canadian citizens who had been assured that the annexation was a partnership, a formalization of the close relationship between neighboring nations who shared so much in common, discovered what partnership meant when it was defined entirely by the partner with the larger military. Conscription was extended to Canadian citizens to fill the ranks of an American military fighting a war that Canada had not chosen to join. Resources were extracted from Canadian territory at rates that Canadian environmental regulations would never have permitted, and that American military necessity simply overrode. Civilians who protested were handled with the particular efficiency that military governance applies to civilian dissent, and some of them were shot, and the recordings of these events exist in the world that the bombs left behind, preserved in terminals and on holotapes, voices from a country that was absorbed and then irradiated, and now exists only as a region of the wasteland with a different history than the region immediately south of it. The soldiers who carried out these operations were not, in the main, monsters. That distinction matters and deserves the attention it rarely receives. They were people formed by a society that had told them a particular story about what they were doing and why, equipped with a moral vocabulary that categorized their actions as defense and liberation and necessary sacrifice, surrounded by institutions that confirmed this categorization and provided no alternative framework. The Canadian civilian who was shot for refusing conscription was not shot by someone who thought of themselves as an occupier shooting a freedom fighter. They were shot by someone who understood the situation in terms of military authority and civilian compliance and the maintenance of order in a wartime environment. The gap between those two understandings is not a gap between good and evil, but a gap between perspectives, between the view from inside the story a civilization tells about itself and the view from outside it. And that gap is one of the most important things the ruins of the pre-war world preserve for anyone patient enough to look carefully at them. The Wasteland's violence, which is considerable and various and often spectacular in its brutality, does not generally come wrapped in this kind of language. When a raider wants what you have, the raider expresses this desire directly through aggression and threat, and occasionally through the blunt instrument of immediate violence. This is not an endorsement of raiders. Raider violence is real violence, and it ends real lives, and it creates real suffering in the communities it touches. But there is a particular additional cruelty and violence that narrates itself as benevolence, that occupies and extracts and conscripts and shoots, while maintaining that what it is doing is protecting and partnering and defending and liberating, because that narration requires the people on the receiving end of the violence to doubt not only their safety, but their own perception of events, to wonder whether the story being told about what is happening to them might be more accurate than their direct experience of it. The resource wars did this to millions of people across 3 continents and a quarter century, and the pre-war world's communications apparatus ensured that the people most insulated from the consequences were also the most thoroughly exposed to the narration. The Americans in their suburban homes, with their Nuka-Cola and their Mr. Handy units receiving a version of events so comprehensively curated that the connection between their comfortable lives and the violence required to sustain them remained invisible right up until the morning when visibility became irrelevant. The corporations had been preparing for their ascendance for longer than most people understood, which was itself a function of the corporations' preparations. The systematic defunding and delegitimizing of the oversight mechanisms that might have made their accumulation of power visible and therefore resistible, happening gradually enough that each individual step seemed manageable, seemed like a reasonable accommodation to economic reality, seemed like the kind of pragmatic adjustment that sensible people made in complicated times. By the middle decades of the 21st century, the distinction between corporate and governmental authority in America had become difficult to locate with any precision, the personnel moving freely between regulatory agencies and the industries they regulated, the lobbying operations of major corporations constituting something closer to a parallel legislative process than the mere influence purchasing that earlier generations had criticized and attempted to constrain. The corporations did not replace the government in any dramatic or legible way. They simply became the government's primary client, the entity whose needs the government's apparatus was most reliably organized to serve. And the transition was so gradual and so thoroughly narrated as normal and inevitable that it barely registered as a transition at all. Vault-Tek's relationship with the federal government was the most consequential of these arrangements, and also, in a dark way, the most illuminating about what the pre-war power structure had actually become. The contract to design, build, and operate the national vault system was the largest government contract in American history, a project of such enormous scope and complexity that the government lacked the institutional capacity to oversee it in any meaningful way, which Vault-Tek's lobbyists had understood when they structured the contract's oversight provisions. The vaults were presented to the public as the government's shelter program, a national investment in civilian survival, and the government was content to allow this presentation because the political benefits of being associated with the program were real, while the political costs of examining what Vault-Tec was actually doing with the contract were entirely avoidable. The arrangement suited everyone who had any power to examine it, which meant that no one with any power to examine it did, which meant that Vault-Tec was free to design the vaults according to criteria that had nothing to do with the survival they were advertised as providing. Robco Industries occupied a different position in the corporate landscape, but an equally powerful one: its control over automated systems and computing infrastructure, making it essential to virtually every other major industry's operations, while creating dependencies that were difficult to perceive until they became impossible to escape. The factories that produced the consumer goods of pre-war prosperity ran on Robco systems. The military's logistical infrastructure ran on Robco systems. The financial networks that processed transactions and maintained records ran on Robco systems. When a company controls the infrastructure that other essential systems depend upon, its leverage over those systems is total, even without any formal authority. And Robco exercised that leverage in ways that were creative and comprehensive, and that the pre-war regulatory framework was not equipped to address, because the regulatory framework had been designed for a world in which corporations were powerful but not yet sovereign. The displacement of human labor by Robco's automated systems was one of the most consequential and least discussed social transformations of the pre-war period. The factories that had employed generations of working-class Americans being progressively automated in ways that increased productivity enormously and distributed the gains of that productivity almost entirely to the companies and their shareholders, the workers who had been displaced receiving retraining, vouchers, and government assistance programs that were systematically underfunded and that connected, ultimately, to a labor market that had fewer positions to offer with each passing year. The human cost of this displacement was enormous, and it was borne by people who lacked the political influence to make it visible to the people who might have addressed it. The cheerful advertisements continuing to celebrate the American worker above the factories from which the American worker had been systematically removed. General Atomics International made its particular contribution to the pre-war world's recklessness through the normalization of nuclear technology in domestic and civilian contexts at a scale and speed that no reasonable safety culture could have accommodated. The decision to power household robots with atomic cores was not primarily a technical decision, but an economic one. Nuclear fuel being cheap and abundant in a way that petroleum was increasingly not. The civilian applications of nuclear technology providing General Atomics with a market that was essentially limitless if the public could be persuaded to accept atomic energy in their homes and their vehicles and their workplaces as routine and unfrightening. The public was persuaded through advertising campaigns of remarkable sophistication and through government endorsements that reflected the government's financial relationship with General Atomics more than any independent safety assessment. And the nuclear-powered cars that appeared on American highways in the decades before the war were genuinely convenient and genuinely dangerous in ways that the convenience tended to overwhelm in public discourse. The relationship between the Wasteland's more legible power structures and the pre-war world's invisible ones is worth sitting with for a moment in the dark. Caesar's legion is terrible. Its cruelty is systematic, and its philosophy is one that most Wasteland inhabitants, given a genuine choice, would reject. But Caesar does not claim to be providing a service. He does not describe his conquests as partnerships, or his slavery as employment, or his violence as protection. The NCR is corrupt, and its corruption causes real harm to real people in communities that thought they were joining a republic and discovered they had joined an empire with democratic aesthetics. But the NCR's corruption is a corruption of stated ideals, rather than a substitution of hidden ones, and the gap between what it claims to be and what it is can at least be named and criticized within its own political culture. Mr. House is an autocrat who has decided that the future of humanity should be shaped by his vision and no one else's, and he says so directly to anyone who asks. The pre-war world's power structures offered none of this legibility, none of this directness, none of this willingness to be perceived clearly. They wrapped their authority in the language of service and their exploitation in the language of opportunity. and their consolidation of power in the language of efficiency and innovation. And the people living inside those structures had almost no mechanism for seeing them clearly, even when they sensed that something was wrong. West-Tek's contract with the government had grown so enormous that the pharmaceutical company had effectively become a military research institution that also happened to produce consumer healthcare products on the side. The relationship between its civilian and military divisions maintained primarily for the legal and public relations benefits that civilian operations provided, rather than because either division meaningfully constrained the other. The direction of this research and the uses to which its findings were put had ceased to be determined by anything resembling scientific ethics or genuine concern for human welfare, and had become entirely a function of what the military's strategic priorities required, which is how a company that began by developing vaccines and medicines arrived at the forced evolutionary virus, which was not a medicine and was not designed to help anyone, but was instead the weaponization of biological science at its most ambitious and its most reckless. This is not a story about a single corrupt executive or a single bad decision, but about a system that had organized itself so thoroughly around certain priorities that different outcomes had become structurally impossible, in which the scientists who might have objected had been selected out over decades in favor of scientists who understood what their employers needed and delivered it. Nuka-Cola's empire was of a softer character than West-Tek's or Vault-Tek's, but in some ways more revealing of the pre-war world's essential nature, because Nuka-Cola's product was not weapons or vaults, but refreshment, carbonated water and flavoring, and the particular color of that particular blue that its marketing department had determined was the precise shade of optimism. And the empire it had built on this product was genuinely enormous, its distribution network reaching into every corner of American life, its brand so thoroughly embedded in American cultural identity that the difference between the drink and the idea of America had become difficult to locate. You did not buy Nuka-Cola because you were thirsty. You bought it because buying it was an act of participation in something larger than thirst, a confirmation of identity, a small daily expression of belonging to the world, the advertisements described. The machines still hum in the ruins. The bottles are still found in the rubble of every settlement and every collapsed diner and every empty house where someone's life stopped on an October morning. The product outlasted the civilization that produced it, which is either a testament to pre-war engineering or a final judgment on what that civilization had valued most. The government was not a neutral party to any of this. That point requires stating clearly, because the pre-war narrative that circulated within the pre-war world itself described the government as a mediating force, a referee between competing interests, the protector of citizens against the excesses of corporate power. This description had never been entirely accurate, and by the final decades before the war, it had ceased to have even a ceremonial relationship with reality. The government did not regulate Vault-Tec because Vault-Tec's lobbyists had ensured that the regulatory framework contained no mechanism by which meaningful regulation could occur. It did not constrain Robco's labor market disruptions because the officials who might have written those constraints had been educated to believe that market forces were self-correcting and that government interference with them was inherently counterproductive. It did not question West-Tek's military research programs because those programs were classified and the classification system existed partly to protect legitimate security interests and partly to protect the programs from scrutiny that might have led to their modification or termination. The Enclave, which understood itself as the legitimate continuation of the American government, and in a strictly genealogical sense was not wrong about this, had concluded sometime in the pre-war period that the majority of the American population was expendable, that the civilization, the government, existed to protect, and the population it nominally served were separable categories, and that when the catastrophe came, the relevant question was not how to protect the people, but how to preserve the institutional apparatus and the elite networks that had actually been running things all along. The bunkers and the oil rigs and the evacuation plans that the Enclave prepared were not secret in the way that military operations are secret, but in the way that a magician's trick is secret. Visible to anyone who looked at the right things in the right order, but surrounded by enough misdirection that looking in the right places required a particular kind of attention that most people, occupied with their jobs and their families and their Nuka-Cola and their anxieties about the war, did not have available. The ordinary citizens who gathered in front of their locked vault doors on the morning of October 23rd had been told that their government had provided for them. In a narrow sense, this was true. The provision was just not for their benefit. The Chinese-American community experienced the pre-war government's relationship with its citizens in a form that stripped away the usual narrations and revealed the structure beneath more clearly than the structure was, typically willing to reveal itself. Following the outbreak of the Sino-American War, Chinese Americans were subjected to internment and surveillance programs that the government described as security measures, and that were in practice the application of ethnic suspicion to an entire population on the basis of ancestry. The assumption that Chinese heritage constituted a security risk being so thoroughly embedded in the program's design that no mechanism existed for an individual to demonstrate its inapplicability to their particular case. People who had lived in America for generations, whose children had been born American, whose loyalty to American institutions was genuine and deep, found themselves placed under surveillance and removed from their communities and interned in facilities that the government's communications apparatus described with language chosen to make them sound less like what they were. The mandatory reporting programs that encouraged citizens to report suspicious neighbors served multiple purposes simultaneously, only some of which were related to actual security concerns. They were effective at identifying genuine threats sometimes, though perhaps not more effective than less invasive methods would have been. They were also effective at creating a social atmosphere of mutual surveillance that made organized dissent more difficult and more dangerous, at ensuring that people who might have objected to government or corporate policies had to weigh those objections against the possibility that their neighbors might interpret the objection as suspicious and report it, at maintaining the general proposition that loyalty was demonstrated through compliance and that compliance was the expected baseline from which deviation required justification. The wasteland has its authoritarian structures, and they are real, and they cause real suffering. But even the most brutal of the wasteland's authoritarian arrangements does not generally require its subjects to surveil each other as a condition of citizenship, to participate in their own governance by monitoring the people around them for signs of insufficient participation. The propaganda that sustained all of this was not crude. That is important to understand. Crude propaganda is easy to recognize and therefore relatively easy to resist. Its distance from reality apparent to most people who encounter it in a context that allows for comparison. The pre-war government and its corporate partners had produced something considerably more sophisticated, a comprehensive information environment so thoroughly saturated with consistent messaging that the messaging had ceased to be visible as messaging and had become simply the texture of reality, the assumed background against which individual experience was understood and interpreted. The Vault Boy's smile was not an accident. It was the output of design processes that had studied human psychology with considerable sophistication and concluded that the particular combination of cheerfulness and competence that the mascot embodied would most effectively associate the feeling of safety with the products and programs it represented. The feeling of safety was the product. The vaults were merely the delivery mechanism. What the wasteland offers in place of this, what it has that the pre-war world specifically lacked, is a legibility about the nature of danger. The radiation is visible on your Pip-Boy as a number that climbs when you are in a bad place and falls when you leave it. The threat presented by another person in the wasteland is generally communicated through their posture and their weapons and their willingness to negotiate, rather than through a carefully constructed communications campaign designed to make the threat feel like protection. The communities of the wasteland were built by people who knew they were building them. who chose their members and their locations and their rules with the specific and conscious intention of surviving, who had no mechanism for pretending that their safety was provided by someone else, and no incentive to maintain that pretense. This is not comfort. The wasteland is not comfortable. But it is, in its brutal and irradiated way, honest about what it is and what it costs and what it asks of the people who live in it. And that honesty is something the pre-war world, for all its brightness and all its wonders, had very deliberately and very systematically decided it could not afford. The vaults that Vault-Tec built were the pre-war world's truest monument, not in the sense that they were representative of its stated values, but in the sense that they were representative of its actual ones, the values it practiced rather than the ones it advertised, the beliefs it revealed through action rather than the ones it expressed through language. On the surface, the Vault program was the government's greatest expression of concern for its citizens, a massive national investment in civilian survival, the assurance that the people of America would be protected if the worst came. The advertisements were beautiful, and the facilities were impressive, and the Vault boy smiled his wide and reassuring smile from every surface, and none of it was what it claimed to be. And the people who discovered this were the people inside the vaults after the doors closed, at which point the discovery was academic. Vault-Tec's representatives attended meetings with government officials and military planners in the years before the war, in which the experimental nature of the Vault program was discussed directly, in which specific parameters for specific social experiments were agreed upon and approved, in which the question of what would happen to the human beings inside these facilities when the experiments were implemented was addressed in the language of research protocols and statistical significance and acceptable variables, rather than the language of what it actually was, which was the deliberate infliction of suffering on people who had been told they were being protected. These meetings happened. The records of them exist, scattered across terminals in the ruins, the bureaucratic language of pre-war government policy unchanged and intact in the amber of the apocalypse, readable by anyone who finds them and takes the time to understand what they are looking at. Vault 11 was designed around a requirement for annual human sacrifice. The population informed that one of their number must die each year, or all would die. The experiment designed to study how human communities organized themselves around unavoidable moral catastrophe, what social structures and rationalizations they developed to manage the requirement of choosing who would die, how the chosen were selected, and how the choosing changed the choosers over time. The people who entered Vault 11 entered believing they were going to survive. They survived by deciding, year after year, who among them would not. The recorded history that remains in the Vault's terminals is a document of what this did to a community over time, how the mechanisms of selection evolved, and the rationalizations became more elaborate, and the violence required to maintain the system grew, as the system's horror became more completely understood by the people inside it. The Vault's designers monitored this from outside and recorded their observations in the language of scientific progress. Vault 12, located beneath Necropolis in California, was designed with a door that would not seal properly, a deliberate flaw that would expose its inhabitants to radiation levels that the designers knew would be lethal over a sufficient period. The experiment serving the interests of the master's biological research programs by providing a controlled population of irradiation subjects from whom the effects of prolonged radiation exposure could be studied. The people who entered Vault 12 entered believing that the door would seal, believing that the technology which had been sold to them as their salvation was functional, and they were irradiated, and they died, or they became ghouls, and the research data was collected, and somewhere in the bureaucratic apparatus of the pre-war government, this outcome was recorded as a successful experimental result, rather than as the deliberate murder of an entire community. Vault 92, built in the wilderness of what had been Maine, subjected its population to subliminal white noise broadcasts designed to trigger violent psychotic episodes. The experiment studying the relationship between subtle audio manipulation and escalating aggression in a closed population, the research having potential applications in both military psychological operations and crowd control. The musicians who were recruited for Vault 92 were told that their vault was designed specifically for artists, that their skills would be valued and their community would be enriched by the concentration of creative talent that the selection process had assembled. They were told this because they needed to be told something that would make them willing to enter, and this particular story was one that the selection team had determined would be most persuasive to the demographic they were targeting. The violence that eventually consumed the Vault's population was documented in entries that read like the testimony of people who could not understand what was happening to them, who experienced the escalating aggression as a mystery rather than as the intended outcome of a designed experiment, who had no way of knowing that the music rooms they used were also broadcasting at frequencies below conscious perception, teaching their nervous systems a lesson about violence that their conscious minds had not agreed to learn. Vault 101, in the ruins of the American capital, was designed to remain sealed permanently, never to open. Its population intended to live and die and reproduce through generations entirely within its walls. The experiment, studying the long-term social and psychological effects of permanent isolation, what cultures and hierarchies and mythologies a sealed community would develop when the outside world was not merely dangerous, but definitionally absent from their experience. The overseer who governed Vault 101 wielded absolute authority because the vault's design required absolute authority to maintain permanent closure, and the authority that was required to maintain permanent closure was also sufficient to maintain the conditions inside the vault that permanent closure created, the circular logic of the design ensuring that the experiment's parameters were self-reinforcing. A child born in Vault 100 and one in the generations after the war had no framework for understanding that the outside world was habitable, that the door that had been described as the only barrier between life and death was in fact the only barrier between one way of life and another. The experiment required this ignorance, and the vault's social structures maintained it with an efficiency that the designers, had they still existed to observe it, might have described as a successful result. Vault 77 exists at the edges of the record, referenced in holotapes and terminal entries that paint a picture of an experiment that was either a joke in very poor taste or a study of human psychology under conditions of absolute isolation. A single man sealed in a vault with a crate of puppets and nothing else. The experiment presumably designed to study what a human mind does when deprived of all genuine human contact, but provided with the materials for simulating it. The entries this man left behind are alternately funny and heartbreaking, in the way that all genuine records of human endurance in impossible circumstances tend to be: a person discovering the resources of their own mind against a backdrop of complete and deliberately designed loneliness. Whether the experiment was designed to produce useful research data, or whether someone in Vault-Tek's experimental design division had simply decided to see what would happen is, in the record that remains, impossible to determine. Both possibilities say something about the organization. Vault 81, in the Commonwealth, was designed to conduct medical research on its inhabitants through their water supply and their food and the air they breathed. The experiments intended to develop immunity to diseases and exposure to various experimental compounds, the ultimate goal being the development of cures that would be tremendously valuable to whoever held the patents after the war. The children in Vault 81 were the primary subjects, their developing immune systems more responsive to the experimental interventions, and their smaller body mass requiring smaller quantities of experimental compounds. The practicalities of the research protocol, aligning with the vulnerability of the population in ways that the protocol's designers had calculated and accepted. The researchers in the facility knew what they were doing. The holotapes they left behind make this clear. They experienced their work as scientific progress, and some of them experienced it as personally uncomfortable and some of them experienced it as morally necessary, and some of them experienced it as simply their job. And all of these experiences existed simultaneously in a single facility where children were being medicated without their knowledge or consent in the service of research that might, if the war had not intervened, have made someone very wealthy. The systematic nature of these experiments is what makes them the purest expression of the pre-war world's values, purer than the advertisements, and purer than the propaganda, and purer than the speeches about American greatness and the promise of a better tomorrow. The experiments reveal what the pre-war world actually believed about the people who lived in it, when the belief was expressed in action rather than in language. It believed that some people were more important than other people, that the important people were the ones who understood the experiments and designed them and stood to benefit from their results, and that the less important people were the ones inside the vaults being studied, that the gap between these two categories was so large and so natural that crossing it required no particular justification, that the subjects of the experiments were resources to be used in the production of knowledge that would benefit the people who mattered, and that describing this arrangement as anything other than what it was would not have occurred to the people designing it, because the arrangement seemed to them simply like the way things were. The wasteland has its cruelties. It has slavers, and it has raiders, and it has the Institute taking people from their homes in the dark and replacing them with machines. But the wasteland's cruelties are generally personal in a way that makes them resistible. The slaver who takes you, knowing you specifically, your body and your labor and your capacity for work, not your statistical potential as a research subject. The violence directed at you as a particular person in a particular place, rather than as a variable in an experimental design that was approved in a committee meeting you never attended and never knew existed. The pre-war world's deepest cruelty was impersonal and procedural, and approved at the highest levels of the government that described itself as your protector, and the people it was practiced upon never had the opportunity to resist it, because they never had the opportunity to know it was happening. The door closed and the experiment began, and the people inside called it their lives. The science of the pre-war world was genuinely extraordinary, and that extraordinariness is part of what makes its corruption so complete and so worth examining carefully in the dark before sleep carries you away from it. The researchers who worked in the great laboratories of West-Tek and the military installations that West-Tek's government contracts had effectively colonized were talented people, many of them brilliant people who had devoted the best years of their lives and the finest capacities of their minds to problems that genuinely fascinated them, whose engagement with the deep questions of biology and chemistry and physics was real, and whose discoveries represented authentic advances in human understanding of the natural world. This is not a story about bad scientists. It is a story about what happens to science when the institutions that house it are organized around priorities that have nothing to do with scientific values, when the funding structures and the classification systems and the military contracts that sustain the laboratories are controlled by people whose interests in the research are entirely downstream of what the research might be used for, rather than what it might reveal. The science was real. What was done with it was something else entirely. West-Tek Research Incorporated began as a pharmaceutical and medical technology company in the way that many such companies begin, with genuine therapeutic ambitions and genuine early successes. Drug compounds that treated conditions that had previously been untreatable, and medical technologies that saved lives in ways that justified the investment required to develop them. The company's reputation in the decades before the resource wars was built on this foundation. Its name associated in public consciousness with the kind of beneficial innovation that the pre-war world used as evidence of its own civilizational virtue, the proof that the system worked. That private enterprise directed toward human need produced human flourishing. The government contracts that began to arrive as the military buildup accelerated were welcomed as both financial opportunity and patriotic obligation. The framing of military research as national service being sufficiently comfortable for most of the researchers involved that the shift in the work's fundamental direction did not register as the categorical transformation. It actually was. The forced evolutionary virus did not begin as a weapon. That point is worth establishing clearly because the distance between what it began as and what it became is itself a kind of education about the pre-war world's scientific establishment and the path that establishment traveled. Over the decades between the mid-century and the final morning, the research that would eventually produce the FEV originated in genuine scientific inquiry into the mechanisms of disease resistance. The question of whether human immunity could be fundamentally enhanced through targeted viral intervention, whether a carefully engineered pathogen could be made to rewrite the human immune system's baseline capabilities in ways that would provide protection against the full range of biological threats rather than against the specific pathogens for which conventional vaccines could be produced. This was not a trivial question. It was a question with real therapeutic potential, connected to problems of genuine human suffering, and the early research pursued it with the kind of methodological rigor and scientific honesty that legitimate inquiry requires. The military's interest arrived when the research reached a stage at which the virus's capacity for producing rapid and substantial biological change in its hosts became apparent. The immune enhancement applications suddenly appearing less important than the question of what other kinds of biological change might be achievable through similar mechanisms. Whether the same approach that could rewrite immunity might rewrite other fundamental biological characteristics. Whether soldiers could be made stronger or faster or more resistant to damage or to the psychological effects of combat through controlled viral modification of their underlying biology. The classified programs that were established to pursue these questions took the research in directions that its original designers had not anticipated, and that the pre-war classification system ensured they could not publicly object to. The security frameworks that surrounded military research, serving among their other functions, the function of preventing the people doing the research from having conversations with the people outside the research who might have raised concerns about where it was going. The Mariposa military base in California was where the FEV research reached its operational phase, which is a bureaucratic way of saying that it was where the question of what the virus did to human beings stopped being theoretical and started being answered through experiments on human beings. The population of subjects acquired through mechanisms that the military's legal advisors had determined were defensible, and that anyone examining them without the benefit of that legal advice would have recognized immediately as what they were, which was the coercion of vulnerable people into experimental programs they had not agreed to and could not leave. Soldiers assigned to Mariposa as punishment details, prisoners transferred from military correctional facilities, civilians from surrounding areas whose presence in the experimental subject pool was documented in terms that the classification system ensured would never be examined by anyone without a security clearance that most of the people processing the documentation did not themselves possess. The experiments were conducted with scientific rigor. The results were carefully recorded. The subjects were exposed to the virus in controlled conditions, and the effects were observed and measured and catalogued in the language of experimental science, which is a language well suited to the precise description of biological processes and entirely unsuited to the description of what it felt like to be a person inside those processes without having chosen to be there. What the FEV did to human biology in the concentrations and delivery mechanisms tested at Mariposa was not enhancement in any sense that the enhancement's recipients would have recognized as such. The cellular restructuring that the virus produced was massive and rapid, and accompanied by effects that the experimental data recorded as adverse outcomes, and that the subjects, when they retained sufficient cognitive function to describe their experience, described in terms that the experimental record does not preserve, because preserving them would have required acknowledging that the data points were people. The supermutants that the Master would later produce using the FEV were the military's experimental outcomes extended beyond the parameters that the military had been pursuing. The virus having effects on human cognition and personality and identity that the Mariposa research had documented and that the Master had decided were acceptable costs for the kind of physical transformation the virus could produce. The soldiers who fought super mutants across the wastes of California and beyond were fighting the consequences of a research program that the pre-war government had approved, funded, classified, and conducted on involuntary human subjects in facilities whose locations were not on any public map. The FEV was not the only line of biological research that the pre-war military pursued with enthusiasm and without ethical constraint. The programs examining the potential for weaponizing radiation exposure, for engineering pathogens that would target specific genetic profiles, for producing organisms that could survive in contaminated environments and serve military purposes in regions where human soldiers could not operate safely. All of these ran parallel to the FEV research in the classified sections of facilities that the public understood as pharmaceutical companies or agricultural research stations, or simply as restricted military installations whose purpose was not specified and whose personnel were not available for comment. The scale of this enterprise was enormous, the resources devoted to the weaponization of biological science representing a substantial fraction of the pre-war military's research budget, and the discoveries it produced were real discoveries, genuine advances in the understanding of biological systems that happened to be oriented entirely toward the production of harm. Project Safehouse, which appears in the pre-war record as a reference in documents that are themselves references to classified documents that no longer exist in accessible form, seems to have involved the attempted weaponization of ghoulification. The research question being whether the radiation exposure that produced ghouls could be controlled sufficiently to produce soldiers who were resistant to radiation and hostile environments, while retaining enough cognitive function to follow orders and pursue military objectives. The ghouls who wander the wasteland are the unintended products of nuclear war, people transformed by the radiation they could not escape, their condition the consequence of catastrophe rather than design. Project Safehouse represents the attempt to make that transformation intentional and controllable and deployable as a military asset. The research question treating the condition of people who had been irradiated as a potential resource rather than as a human tragedy requiring response. Whether the project produced results before the bombs fell is unknown. The record that remains is fragmentary and incomplete, and the facilities that housed the research are either destroyed or so thoroughly buried in the ruins that their contents have not been recovered. What is known is that the question was asked and that someone with access to sufficient military funding considered it worth pursuing. The scientific establishment's capture by military and corporate interests did not happen through any dramatic or legible conversion of values, but through the same gradual mechanism that produced most of the pre-war world's most significant transformations, the incremental normalization of small compromises that each seemed reasonable in isolation, and that accumulated into a total reorientation of the enterprise's fundamental purpose. A researcher accepts a military contract because the funding will allow the lab to continue work that has no military application, but that the lab's operating budget cannot otherwise support. The contract's classified nature means the research it funds cannot be published, which means the researcher's professional reputation depends on the unclassified work, which means the classified work receives less of the researcher's best attention and more of whatever is necessary to satisfy the contract requirements. Over time, the contract grows, and the unclassified work shrinks, and the researcher's relationship to the military's priorities has become structural rather than incidental, has become the shape of the work itself rather than a funding source for something else. And the point at which this happened is genuinely difficult to locate in retrospect, because it did not happen at a single moment, but across a long series of moments, each of which seemed like a reasonable continuation of what had come before. The resources that were devoted to the weaponization of science were not available for other things. This seems obvious when stated directly, but its implications are worth following. The pre-war world had genuine public health crises, diseases, and conditions that caused enormous suffering, and that the scientific establishment might have addressed if its priorities had been organized differently. It had agricultural challenges. The challenge of feeding a growing population on a diminishing resource base, being one that genuine scientific investment in food production systems might have done something about, before it became the famine that drove China's expansion. It had environmental problems. The consequences of a century of industrial activity on the planet's climate and ecosystems being well understood by pre-war scientists who had published extensively on the subject and been largely ignored by the political, corporate structures that might have responded to their findings. The science that existed was not directed toward these problems, not because they were scientifically intractable, but because addressing them was not militarily useful and not immediately profitable, and the people who controlled the resources that directed scientific priorities had concluded that other questions were more pressing. The bombs that fell on October 23rd were made by brilliant people. The diseases that they could have been curing instead killed people too, more slowly and less dramatically, but in numbers that the pre-war world's public health statistics record, with the same flat, bureaucratic indifference that characterizes most documentation of ordinary suffering. The poverty of the pre-war world was not an accident. This is perhaps the most important thing to understand about it, the fact that distinguishes it most clearly from the wasteland's deprivations, which are the consequence of a civilization's destruction rather than the deliberate or structural product of its normal functioning. The wasteland is poor because the infrastructure that produced and distributed material goods was destroyed in a single catastrophic morning and has been rebuilding itself from fragments and salvage ever since. The poverty of the wasteland being the poverty of aftermath, of ruins, of a world trying to reconstruct the preconditions for flourishing from materials that were designed for a different world. The poverty of the pre-war world was the poverty of a system working as intended, the distribution of deprivation and abundance being not an accident or a failure, but the output of choices made by people with the power to make different choices, who had concluded that different choices were not in their interest. The tent cities appeared at the edges of American urban centers in the decades before the war, with a gradual persistence that the news media covered initially with concern and then with diminishing frequency as concern produced no change. And the absence of change made the story repetitive, and the repetition made the coverage feel futile, and the futility became a reason not to look. People who had worked in manufacturing facilities that Robco's automated systems had rendered unprofitable to staff with humans. People who had worked in agricultural operations that the consolidation of land ownership into the hands of agribusiness corporations had stripped of their livelihoods. People who had worked in service industries that a declining consumer economy had contracted past the point at which their labor was required, collected in encampments along the highways and beneath the overpasses of the pre-war infrastructure that had been built for a different distribution of people than the one that was actually using it. They were there. Everyone who lived in the cities near which they gathered knew they were there. The mechanisms by which the pre-war world processed this knowledge were sophisticated and consistent and almost entirely effective at preventing the knowledge from becoming action. The poverty was framed as individual failure with a thoroughness and a consistency that required considerable institutional effort to maintain. The gap between the structural causes of the deprivation and the individual failure narrative that explained it being wide enough that substantial resources were required to keep it invisible. The news commentary that addressed the tent cities, when it addressed them at all, employed the language of choices and decisions, and the failure to take advantage of opportunities that were described as available to anyone with sufficient motivation, the implication being that the people in the tents had made different choices and that different choices would have produced different circumstances. The educational materials that pre-war children received in their schools included economics curricula that explained market outcomes as the natural and just reflection of individual productivity and social contribution, that described the accumulation of wealth as the reward for useful work, and the experience of poverty as the consequence of its absence. The children who received this education and then looked at the tent cities outside their school windows were equipped with a framework for understanding what they saw that made intervention seem both unnecessary and inappropriate. The suffering they were observing having been explained to them as self-generated. The workers at Corvega's automotive manufacturing plants in the years before the war were among the last generation of Americans employed in large-scale industrial production. The automation wave that had already consumed most comparable industries, having been held off at Corvega by a combination of technical challenges specific to nuclear automotive manufacturing and political calculations that the company's executives had made about the optics of mass layoffs in an already volatile employment climate. They worked 60-hour weeks in conditions that the pre-war occupational safety standards described as acceptable, and that the workers themselves, in the records they left behind, in terminals, and in the holotapes their personal communications generated, described in terms that suggest a different assessment. The wages they earned were sufficient to maintain the kind of life the advertisements depicted as the baseline American experience, only if certain costs were carefully managed, if medical care was deferred, if the children's education was public rather than private, if the nuclear-powered car was older and less well-maintained than the ones on the billboards, if the Nuka-Cola was a treat rather than a daily expectation. The advertisements surrounded them at every surface, and the life those advertisements depicted was visible to them in detail, available to their observation, but not to their participation. The dream sold to them daily in a currency they could not quite accumulate. The private bunkers that existed beneath the properties of the pre-war wealthy were not advertised in the same way that the Vault-Tec shelters were advertised, not positioned with cheerful mascots and government endorsements, but sold through the quiet channels by which expensive things are sold to people with sufficient resources to purchase them without requiring the validation of mass marketing. These facilities were technically superior to the government vaults, in the ways that privately purchased things often are technically superior to publicly provided ones, better stocked and better maintained and designed with the comfort of their eventual inhabitants in mind, rather than the requirements of an experimental protocol. The people who would shelter in them were not research subjects. They were customers whose satisfaction mattered to the companies that had built for them. And the distinction between these two categories is one of the most concise and available expressions of what the pre-war world actually believed about its population and how it organized that belief into concrete, physical reality. The public shelters that were described in government preparedness materials as available to the general population in the event of nuclear attack were, in most American cities, not sufficient in number or capacity to accommodate the population they theoretically served, a shortfall that the preparedness materials did not highlight, and that the oversight mechanisms that might have demanded it be addressed had been defunded or captured, or both. The people who would arrive at shelter entrances on the morning of October 23rd and find the doors closed would not, in most cases, have known before that morning that the doors would be closed, because the information that would have allowed them to know this was not available to them, was in fact specifically not available to them, because making it available would have raised questions that the government preferred not to answer, while the questioning could still have led somewhere useful. The inheritance of pre-war wealth was so thoroughly naturalized in pre-war American culture that the mechanisms by which it operated were almost entirely invisible as mechanisms, understood simply as the way things were, the natural and inevitable consequence of the talent and effort and prudent decision-making of earlier generations, whose rewards were appropriately passed to their descendants. The children of the pre-war wealthy entered a world in which their educational opportunities, their professional networks, their access to the private bunkers and the quality healthcare and the political influence that translated private interest into public policy, all of these were distributed to them before they had made any choices at all, the playing field being arranged in their favor by a series of structural advantages that each seemed individually minor, and that combined to produce outcomes as reliably as gravity produces falling. The children of the pre-war poor entered the same world with the same formal rights and the same access to the civic mythology that described America as a place where effort was rewarded and talent was recognized regardless of origin, and they encountered a reality that the mythology had not prepared them to navigate, because the mythology was not a description of the reality, but a replacement for it. A story told in place of the truth, because the truth was not a story that served the interests of the people who controlled the telling. The wasteland is not egalitarian. No honest account of it could claim otherwise. The NCR's political class reproduces itself through networks of influence and education and economic connection that newcomers without established relationships find difficult to penetrate. Caesar's legion has its hierarchy of martial accomplishment and its brutal calculus of value that sorts human beings into categories of usefulness and worthlessness with a directness that is terrible and that is at least honest about being a hierarchy rather than a meritocracy. Mr. House's Vegas distributes its benefits according to a logic that reflects House's own priorities rather than any principle of fairness or need. And yet in each of these structures and in the simpler economies of the wasteland's independent settlements, the possibility of transformation through demonstrated capability is real in ways that the pre-war world stated meritocracy was not. The absence of inherited institutional advantage, meaning that the person born with nothing who develops something worth having, can actually arrive somewhere different from where they started. The courier who began as a messenger and ended as a figure who determined the fate of an entire region is a wasteland story. The pre-war world produced no equivalent, because the pre-war world systems were designed to prevent the kind of vertical mobility that would have required redistributing what those at the top had accumulated. The caps that circulate in the wasteland economy are earned in ways that are visible through labor and trade and the provision of services that people who need those services are willing to pay for, through combat and salvage, and the particular skills that the wasteland's conditions make valuable. The pre-war world's wealth circulated in ways that the economics profession had developed an extensive vocabulary for describing without examining too carefully. The language of investment returns and capital appreciation and market efficiency, providing a sophisticated gloss over the simple reality that the people who had money made more money because they had money, and that this process operated at a scale and a speed that labor could not match, and that the regulatory mechanisms which might have moderated it had been systematically dismantled by the interests that benefited from its operation. A wastelander who finds a cache of caps in a ruined building has found something real, something that reflects the actual distribution of resources that the wasteland contains. A pre-war heir who received a trust fund at 25 had received the accumulated product of mechanisms that had nothing to do with their particular merit or contribution, and everything to do with the family they had been born into, and the mythology that surrounded this fact and made it seem natural and appropriate and just was one of the pre-war world's most remarkable cultural achievements. The propaganda that held all of this together, that made the inequality seem natural and the poverty seem deserved and the corporate power seem beneficial and the government surveillance seem protective and the experimental vaults seem like genuine shelters, was not produced by any single institution or any single decision, but by the accumulated output of every cultural mechanism the pre-war world contained. working in rough concert toward an outcome that served the interests of the people who controlled those mechanisms well enough that no coordination was required. The advertisements and the news broadcasts and the educational materials and the government films and the architecture and the urban planning and the product design all spoke a common language about what the pre-war world was and what it meant and who it was for, and the consistency of that language was not the consistency of conspiracy, but the consistency of a system that had evolved to reproduce itself through the cultural products it generated, selecting for the messages that served its interests and against the messages that questioned them through the same gradual, incremental mechanism by which all the pre-war world's most consequential selections were made. The Vault Boy, smiling from every surface, was the perfect distillation of this propaganda in a single image. The cheerfulness was not incidental. The roundness of the design and the brightness of the colors and the specific quality of the smile, somewhere between competent and innocent, knowing enough to provide reassurance and guileless enough not to raise suspicion, had been arrived at through design processes that understood human psychology with considerable sophistication and that deployed that understanding in service of an idea about nuclear safety that the people who designed the propaganda knew to be false. The government films that taught children to measure radiation exposure by extending their thumb toward a nuclear explosion and checking whether the thumb was larger than the fireball, the implication being that if it was you, were at a safe distance and should simply take shelter, were not produced by people who believed this technique would save lives in the event of a nuclear strike. They were produced by people who understood that the technique would save no one, but who needed to communicate the idea that safety was possible and manageable and available to the prepared, because communicating this idea was more important to the pre-war political project than communicating accurate information about what a nuclear exchange would actually mean for the population it addressed. The Prepared for the Future program that Vault-Tec ran in partnership with the government in the final years before the war reached into elementary school classrooms across America. Its materials bright and cheerful and designed with the same careful attention to child psychology that the best educational materials employ, teaching children about the importance of preparedness and the availability of shelter and the manageability of nuclear danger, with a thoroughness that ensured most American children of the final pre-war generation entered adulthood, with a framework for thinking about nuclear war that had been constructed by an organization with specific financial interest in their believing that nuclear war was survivable and that the mechanism of survival was the Vault program. The curriculum did not include information about the experimental nature of specific vaults. It did not include information about the capacity shortfalls in the public shelter system. It did not include the classified projections that the government's own analysts had produced about casualty rates in the event of a full nuclear exchange. Projections that suggested the cheerful films and the duck and cover drills and the Vault Boy's wide smile were addressed to a population that most honest assessments suggested could not be meaningfully protected by any available means. The nuclear arms race that the propaganda was designed to maintain public support for was itself a feedback loop with no natural terminus, each development in one power's arsenal requiring a corresponding development in the others. The logic of deterrence, demanding that the threat be credible, and the credibility demanding that the weapons be real, and the reality of the weapons making the threat they embodied more, rather than less likely to be carried out as the crisis that would eventually require their use became more, rather than less probable, with each additional weapon added to each additional arsenal. The pre-war governments of America and China both understood this logic and both continued to follow it because the alternative to following it was accepting a position of relative weakness that neither government's political culture permitted, and the populations of both nations were told versions of the situation that made their own government's choices seem defensive and necessary, and the other government's choices seem aggressive and irrational. The propaganda performing its usual function of making the choices of power seem like the responses of virtue. The mandatory reporting programs and the loyalty oaths and the surveillance infrastructure that monitored domestic dissent were all presented to the public in the language of security, the reasonable precautions of a nation at war against an ideology that had demonstrated its willingness to use infiltration and subversion as tools of conflict. This language was not entirely false. The security concerns were real in the way that the concerns of any nation engaged in genuine geopolitical competition with an adversary of comparable capability are real. But the mechanisms that were built to address those concerns extended considerably beyond what the concerns actually required, and the extensions served purposes that had less to do with national security than with the maintenance of political arrangements that dissent and transparency would have threatened. The person who was investigated for suspicious activity because their neighbor had reported them was almost never a Chinese agent. They were almost always someone who had said or done something that was perceived as insufficiently enthusiastic about the pre-war status quo, and the investigation itself, regardless of its outcome, served the purpose of making clear to everyone who observed it that insufficient enthusiasm had costs. The radio broadcasts that filled the pre-war airwaves were not uniformly propagandistic in their content, many of them simply entertainment in the way that entertainment has always been entertainment. Stories and music, and the particular pleasures of being addressed by a friendly voice in a domestic space. But the entertainment was embedded in an information environment that was, and this is the key distinction, saturated with consistent messaging about what America was, and what it meant, and who its enemies were, and why the sacrifices the war required were worthwhile and necessary, and the expression of the nation's deepest values. The music celebrated American life. The drama portrayed American virtue. The news contextualized events in frameworks that the government's communications apparatus had shaped, not always directly or through overt censorship, but through the more efficient mechanism of ensuring that the people who controlled major broadcast licenses understood what kinds of content would result in regulatory difficulties and what kinds would not. The result was an information environment so thoroughly consistent in its fundamental premises that questioning those premises required more than individual skepticism, required the construction of an alternative framework that the available information was not organized to support. The Wasteland's information environment is chaotic and unreliable, and frequently dangerous in ways that the pre-war world's was not. The radio stations that broadcast across the Mojave or the Commonwealth serving audiences with no guarantee that what they hear is accurate, and no mechanism for evaluating its accuracy against alternative sources. This is a genuine loss, the absence of reliable shared information being one of the real deprivations of wasteland existence. The difficulty of making good decisions when the information available to support those decisions is fragmentary and unverifiable, being a consistent source of suffering in wasteland communities. But a person listening to Mr. New Vegas on the radio, or to Three Dogs editorializing from Galaxy News Radio knows, in a way that the pre-war radio listener did not, that they are receiving a particular perspective rather than the perspective, a voice with its own interests and limitations, rather than the neutral broadcast of reality itself. The Wasteland's information chaos, at least, does not produce the specific danger of the pre-war world's information environment, which was the danger of a population so thoroughly surrounded by consistent messaging that they had lost the capacity to perceive it as messaging at all, had come to experience the performance of the pre-war world as simply the texture of reality, indistinguishable from the truth, because it had replaced the truth so completely and for so long. The morning of October 23rd, 2077 arrived in the way that all ordinary mornings arrive, which is to say without announcement, without any quality in the light or the air that distinguished it from the morning before it or the morning before that. The sun coming up over the horizon with the same indifference to human affairs that it had demonstrated every previous morning, and would demonstrate, as it turned out, every subsequent one as well. People woke to alarm clocks, and to the smell of coffee, and to the particular weight of the day's responsibilities already assembling themselves in the back of the mind before full consciousness had arrived. The small negotiations of ordinary life beginning their daily resumption without any indication that they would not be completed, that the afternoon would not follow the morning in the way that afternoons had always followed mornings, that the world which had been there when they went to sleep the night before would not be there when the day was done. The terminals and the holotapes and the environmental storytelling that the Wasteland preserves from that morning are among the most important documents that the pre-war world left behind, not because they are dramatic or revelatory in any large sense, but because they are ordinary, because they record the texture of a morning that was like any other morning until it was not, and the ordinariness of them is what makes them devastating in the specific way that they are devastating. A woman in a Corvega assembly plant in the Commonwealth, writing in her personal terminal about the argument she had with her husband before work, the specific content of the argument being the kind of content that seems enormous in the moment and forgettable a week later, except that the week later did not arrive, and the argument was not forgiven or forgotten, but simply frozen in the moment before the bombs came and preserved there for 200 years, like something caught in amber. The private irritation of a Tuesday morning held intact against all the fire that followed. A man in a diner outside of Goodsprings writing down his lunch order on a paper napkin, the careful notation of a person who knows what they want and intends to have it. The napkin found in the ruins of the diner by someone who would never know anything else about the man who had written it. A child's school assignment on the refrigerator door of a house in the suburbs of Washington, the teacher's cheerful notation of approval in red ink still bright against the yellowed paper. The assignment about what the child wanted to be when they grew up. The answer recorded in the large, careful letters of someone still learning to make letters, preserved in the ruins of the house, while the child who wrote it was not preserved anywhere. The warning systems that existed in 2077 were sophisticated by the standards of the pre-war world and completely inadequate by the standards of what was actually coming, which is a way of saying that they had been designed for scenarios that the people who designed them had considered plausible, and that the actual event exceeded those scenarios in ways that the design had not accommodated. The emergency broadcast system transmitted alerts in the minutes before the first impacts, the familiar tones cutting through the regular programming with the specific urgency that those tones had been designed to communicate. And the people who heard them experienced those minutes in ways that the records they left behind attempt to describe, and that language is not quite sufficient to contain. The gap between what the tones announced and the reality of what was about to happen being so enormous that the mind's first response was not belief, but a kind of suspended incomprehension. The instinct to treat the alert as a drill or an error, competing with the slowly assembling recognition that the other alerts had always been drills, and this one sounded different, felt different, was different in some quality that could not be precisely named, but that the body understood before the mind caught up with it. The people who were near Vault-Tec facilities in those minutes discovered something that the advertising had not communicated and that the preparedness curriculum had not covered, which was that the vaults were not open. The great doors that had been depicted in the marketing materials as welcoming, as the safe and certain threshold between ordinary life and assured survival, were closed, or were closing, or were controlled by automated systems that processed the emergency protocols according to parameters that did not include provisions for the specific circumstances in which actual human beings in actual states of panic found themselves in the actual final minutes before the actual nuclear exchange. The people who gathered at vault doors in those minutes and found them closed or closing had done everything the pre-war world had told them to do, had purchased their preparedness kits and attended their civic information sessions, and understood that the vault was where you went when the warning came, and the vault was not where they went, or it was where they went, but it did not admit them, or it admitted some of them and not others, a according to criteria that the moment did not allow for appeal or examination. In Megaton, which would later grow up around the unexploded bomb that sat in its crater like a monument to the morning that ended everything, there were people on October 23rd who had lived their entire lives within walking distance of where that bomb would fall, and who spent the final minutes of the pre-war world doing the things that people do in the final minutes before they understand that these are the final minutes, which is to say the things they always did, the habits and routines and small rituals of daily life continuing their momentum right up to the moment when the momentum was stopped. The bomb that would not explode landed in a crater that would become a town, and the people who built the town built it without knowing that beneath its central feature lay the compressed history of what had ended and the material possibility of what might end them too. The pre-war world's most direct legacy sitting unexploded in the middle of the community that had grown up in its shadow. No one knows who fired first. This fact, which seems like it should be a minor uncertainty given the scale of everything else that the day produced, is actually one of the most revealing things about it. The thing that most completely expresses what the pre-war world had become in its final years. The chain of command and the automated systems and the geopolitical logic of the moment had created a situation in which the distinction between a first strike and a retaliatory strike had collapsed, in which the question of who initiated the exchange was less important than the question of who had constructed the system of incentives and automated responses that made the exchange almost inevitable once the crisis reached the level of tension it had reached, which was a level of tension that the pre-war world's political and economic structures had been building toward for decades. The missiles came from somewhere, and they went somewhere, and the somewhere they went was everywhere. And the question of which government had pushed the button first was the kind of question that mattered enormously in the context of the narrative frameworks the pre-war world had used to understand international conflict, and that mattered not at all in the context of what was actually happening, which was the end of the world as it had been organized, and the beginning of the world as it would be reorganized by the survivors of the next 200 years. The Enclave's evacuation proceeded with the kind of efficiency that comes from extensive planning and complete absence of competing obligations. The people who had known what was coming, having prepared for it with the resources of the government, whose responsibility to the broader population they were in the process of abandoning. The oil rig platforms in the Pacific, the underground bunkers whose locations had never appeared on any public document, the transportation systems that carried the Enclave's membership to their prepared sanctuaries in the final hours and days before and after the exchange. All of these functioned as designed because they had been designed with care and maintained with resources, and represented the application of genuine institutional capability to the problem of one group's survival. The families who had not been selected for inclusion in these arrangements did not know the arrangements existed. The last thing many of them knew was the brightness, which was not the brightness of the pre-war world's advertisements, but the other kind, the kind that came from the direction of the cities and lasted less than a second and produced a silence that was not peaceful. The automated systems continued to function for some time after the exchange, and this continuation is one of the more philosophically interesting aspects of the pre-war world's destruction. The infrastructure of administration and communication and military command persisting in its operations beyond the point at which there was anything meaningful for it to administer or communicate or command. Military command systems transmitted orders to units that had ceased to exist. Financial networks processed transactions between accounts whose holders had been reduced to the particular category of ash that characterizes the vicinity of a nuclear detonation's ground zero. Maintenance robots continued their scheduled maintenance routines on facilities that no longer needed maintaining. The pre-war world's bureaucratic apparatus, which had been designed with considerable sophistication to operate through disruption and to maintain continuity of function through crisis, operated through this particular disruption and maintained this particular continuity. the machinery of the civilization continuing to run for some time after the civilization itself had stopped. The way a clock continues to tick after the person who wound it has left the room and will not be returning. The Mr. Handy units that had floated through domestic spaces doing the work of daily life continued their routines in the empty houses, dusting surfaces that no one would use and preparing meals that no one would eat and offering pleasantries to inhabitants who would not respond. Their programming not equipped with a concept of absence sufficient to distinguish between a house whose occupants were temporarily elsewhere and a house whose occupants were not coming back. The Securitrons that guarded facilities continued their patrols. The automated turrets that had been installed to protect various installations continued to track movement and to respond to the categories of threat they had been programmed to identify. The world of automation that the pre-war corporations had built outlasted the world that had built it, still performing its functions with the reliability and the complete indifference to context that automated systems are designed to demonstrate, and finding in the ruins a persistence that struck the survivors who encountered it as either reassuring or deeply disturbing, depending on their relationship to the pre-war world that had produced it. The survivors who emerged from the functional vaults, or from natural shelters, or from the particular luck of having been in a place and a configuration that the radiation and the blast effects had not reached, found a world that was recognizable in its physical geography and unrecognizable in everything else, the buildings still standing in some places, and the roads still running between them, and the landscape still having the shape that landscape has, but all of it altered in quality in the way that a face is altered when the person behind it has changed into someone else. The features the same and the expression wrong in some way that is immediately apparent and difficult to specify. The sky was different, the air was different, the silence was different in a way that people who had never experienced the specific silence that follows catastrophic violence struggled to describe, and that people who had experienced it recognized immediately as the silence of death, aftermath, the silence not of rest but of exhaustion, the silence of a world that had been making a very loud noise for a very long time and had finally, in the most drastic possible way, stopped. The first things the survivors did were the things that people do in the immediate aftermath of catastrophe, which is to say, they looked for the people they loved, and they looked for water, and they looked for anything that could tell them what had happened and what was going to happen next. The hierarchy of immediate human need asserting itself through the shock with the same biological insistence that it asserts itself in every crisis. The large questions about meaning and causation and the future of civilization temporarily displaced by the immediate questions of who was alive and where and what could be eaten and what could be drunk. The answers to these questions were often terrible. The people they were looking for were often not findable, or were findable in states that made the finding worse than the not finding. The water was often contaminated. The food was often irradiated. The information about what had happened was either absent or contradictory or coming from sources, like the pre-war emergency broadcast system's automated messages that had been designed for a different scenario and that continued to broadcast instructions that no longer corresponded to any available reality. What the bombs revealed, in stripping away the infrastructure and the institutions and the accumulated weight of the pre-war world's self-narration, was a set of questions about human nature and human possibility that the pre-war world had been answering for decades in ways that served its own interests, and that the Wasteland would have to answer again from the beginning. Without the resources, and without the propaganda, and without the institutional weight that had made the pre-war world's answers seem like facts rather than choices. The question of how communities organize themselves when there is no government to provide the framework for organization. The question of what people owe each other when the social contract has been destroyed, along with everything else. The question of what is worth preserving and what is worth building and who gets to decide. These were not new questions. The pre-war world had answered them in ways that produced a civilization of extraordinary capability and deliberate inequity, of genuine wonder and systematic cruelty, of brightness that was real and performance that sustained it, and the bombs that ended that civilization left the questions open again for the survivors and their descendants to answer differently if they could. The communities that grew up in the ruins of the pre-war world did not emerge from any plan or any institution, but from the same basic human impulse that had always produced communities. The recognition that survival was easier in proximity to other people than it was alone. That the specialization of labor that a community allowed produced outcomes that individual effort could not. That the social animal at the center of human nature requires social existence in order to function at anything approaching its full capacity. Goodsprings grew up around a water source and a general store, the necessities of hydration and trade providing the nucleus around which a community could organize itself. The people who gathered there choosing to be there rather than somewhere else in the way that the pre-war world's suburban communities had not involved a choice so much as a default. The path of least resistance in a housing market organized by forces that had nothing to do with genuine human preference about how and where and with whom to live. The choice was not comfortable. Nothing in the Wasteland's early centuries was comfortable in the way that pre-war suburban life had been comfortable. But it was a choice, real and consequential, in the way that choices are real and consequential when the alternatives are genuinely different and the choosing genuinely matters. Megaton is perhaps the most instructive of the Wasteland's spontaneous communities, built around a bomb that had not exploded and might at some point explode. The absurdity of this foundation being something its residents were entirely aware of, and that they had decided was an acceptable condition for community existence. The alternatives being worse in ways that made the bomb's potential seem less immediately threatening than the certain dangers of the unorganized wasteland. The people who built Megaton did not have architects or urban planners or zoning ordinances or the aesthetic preferences of a marketing department to guide the settlement's physical form. And the result is a community that looks like what it is, which is a collection of people who needed shelter and used the materials available to them to build it as effectively as they could. The structures shaped by necessity and ingenuity rather than by any idea about what a community was supposed to look like. It is ugly by pre-war standards and functional by wasteland ones, and alive in a way that the pre-war suburbs, for all their comfort, were not quite alive. The life of a place built by the people in it for the purpose of their own survival, having a quality that the life of a place built by developers for the purpose of profit does not. Diamond City in the Commonwealth grew up inside a pre-war baseball stadium, which is a detail that deserves more attention than it usually receives. The choice of a sporting arena as the foundation for a human settlement being not random, but the consequence of specific, practical considerations. The stadium's walls being sufficient to keep out the various things that needed keeping out. Its interior being large enough to accommodate a genuine community. Its roof providing shelter in a region where shelter was not to be taken for granted. The community that formed inside the Green Monster's shadow did not inherit any of the pre-war world's institutional frameworks. It built its own, imperfect and sometimes unjust, and always reflecting the specific pressures and personalities of the specific people who were doing the building, which is to say, it built the kind of institutions that human communities have always built when left to build them without external templates. Messy and functional, and shaped by the available human material rather than by any abstract ideal of what governance should look like. The mayor's office that occupied the center of Diamond City's political life was not a position anyone had designed into a constitutional framework. It was a position that had emerged from the practical necessity of having someone make decisions that the community needed to have made, and the authority it carried was the authority that its occupant could convince the community to grant it, rather than the authority of an institution backed by the coercive apparatus of a state. The followers of the apocalypse represent perhaps the purest expression of what the Wastelands communities could produce when they were organized around a genuine idea about human possibility rather than around the imperatives of survival alone. Founded on the principle that knowledge and medicine and education were not the property of any government or corporation, but the common inheritance of humanity that should be made available to whoever needed them. The followers built an organization that operated on values that the pre-war world had claimed to hold and had consistently failed to practice. The gap between stated and actual values that characterized so much of the pre-war institutional landscape being replaced in the followers' case by something closer to genuine consistency between what the organization said it was and what it actually did. The doctors who treated patients without payment in communities that could offer nothing in exchange were not doing this because a corporate structure required it or a government program funded it, but because they had chosen to make this their purpose. The choice being real in the way that the pre-war world's choices about the allocation of medical expertise had not been real, had been the outputs of financial incentives and institutional priorities, rather than genuine human decisions about what the skills one possessed should be used for. The caravans that moved between settlements, carrying goods and information across the wasteland's dangerous distances, rebuilt in improvised form the trade networks that the pre-war world had built through corporate logistics and that the bombs had destroyed along with everything else the corporations had owned. The people who walked those routes were not doing it for the satisfaction of shareholder returns or the optimization of a supply chain, but for the straightforward reason that the goods they carried were things that people needed, and the caps they earned for carrying them were things they needed. The economic relationship between the caravan driver and the settlement buyer being about as direct and legible as an economic relationship can be. The value of the transaction visible to everyone involved, rather than distributed through layers of institutional abstraction that separated the person doing the work from the person benefiting from it by enough distance that the first connection between them was invisible from either end. This directness was not an improvement over the pre-war world's economic sophistication in any technical sense. The pre-war world's logistical capabilities were vastly superior to anything the wasteland caravans could achieve. But the directness was honest in a way that the sophistication had not been, and the honesty had consequences for the people involved that the sophistication's invisibility had not permitted. The settlements of New Vegas and the broader Mojave that the courier moved through in their wandering were a concentrated version of this wasteland dynamic. The proximity to the strip's comparative abundance and the particular mix of factions contending for the region's future, making the Mojave a place where the questions the wasteland posed about human organization were being answered in real time by real people with real stakes in the outcomes. The philosophical abstractions of governance and justice, and the distribution of power having immediate and visible consequences in the lives of the people who lived under whatever arrangement prevailed. The cocktail waitress in the Atomic Wrangler and the prospector in the ruins of Boulder City and the follower medic in Old Mormon Fort were all living answers to the question of what human life looked like when stripped of the pre-war world's institutional frameworks, when the choices that had been made by corporations and governments and propaganda machines on behalf of a population that had not been consulted were replaced by the choices of people who had no choice but to make their own. What the wasteland gave back, in exchange for everything that the bombs had taken, was the knowledge that the pre-war world had most systematically suppressed, which was the knowledge that the arrangements of society were not natural and not inevitable, but chosen, that the distribution of suffering and comfort and power and dignity was not the output of impersonal forces operating beyond human control, but the consequence of decisions made by people who could have decided differently, that the world as it was not the world as it had to be, but the world as it had been made by specific choices, made for specific reasons, that served specific interests. The pre-war world had suppressed this knowledge with extraordinary thoroughness. The education system and the media environment and the political culture all working in the same direction to naturalize the arrangements that served the powerful, and to make alternatives seem either impossible or dangerous, or both. The Wasteland, by destroying those mechanisms of suppression along with everything else they were attached to, left the knowledge available in a way that it had not been available for generations. Available to anyone willing to look at the ruins and ask why they were ruins and what had been in them before they were ruins, and whether what had been in them was worth rebuilding or whether something different might be built in its place. The answer that the Wastelands communities gave to this question varied enormously depending on who was doing the answering and what resources they had available and what threats they faced and what ideas they had inherited from the fragments of the pre-war world that had survived the fire, the diversity of the answers being itself a kind of answer. The demonstration that the pre-war worlds claim to have identified the only viable form of human social organization was as false as most of its other claims. Some communities rebuilt hierarchies that looked very much like the pre-war hierarchies they had replaced, because hierarchy is in many ways the path of least resistance, and because the survivors who remembered the pre-war world had been formed by its assumptions about how power should be organized. Some communities built something different, flatter and more participatory, and sustained by a genuine collective investment in the community's survival that the pre-war world's manufactured consent had never quite achieved. Some built things that were neither better nor worse than what had preceded them, but simply different. The genuine variation that becomes possible when the institutional template that had enforced uniformity is removed. The knowledge that the world could be different was not comfort in any simple sense. The Wasteland did not become a paradise because the pre-war world's suppressive mechanisms had been destroyed. It became a harder and more honest version of the world, a place where the choices that had always been choices were visible as choices, where the suffering that had always been the consequence of decisions was legible as the consequence of decisions, where the question of what kind of world to build was open in a way it had not been for a very long time. This openness was not pleasant. Open questions are not pleasant in the way that settled ones are, the comfort of settled questions being one of the things that the pre-war world had sold very successfully and that the bombs had taken away along with everything else. But openness is what genuine possibility looks like before it becomes anything else. And the Wasteland, in all its brutality and all its suffering and all its irradiated and desperate and remarkably persistent humanity, was open in this sense, was a place where the future was genuinely undecided in a way that the pre-war world, for all its brightness, had not been for a very long time. The people who chose to build, rather than simply survive in the Wasteland, were making an argument about human nature through their actions. The argument being that the capacity for community and cooperation and the investment in something larger than individual survival was not a product of the pre-war world's particular institutional arrangements, but a quality of human beings themselves, present before those arrangements and present after their destruction, available to be organized in forms that the pre-war world had never tried because they did not serve the interests of the people who controlled the trying. This argument was never stated explicitly. It was made through the act of building a water purifier for a community that had none, through the act of teaching a child to read in a settlement where there were no schools, through the act of walking a dangerous road between two communities to carry the things one of them had and the other needed, through all the ordinary, extraordinary acts of a people who had lost everything the pre-war world had told them they needed and had discovered, not without enormous suffering and not without grief for what was gone, that they had not lost the thing the pre-war world had never quite managed to be honest about, which was themselves. The medical infrastructure of the pre-war world was among its most genuine achievements and among its most complete betrayals simultaneously, which is a conjunction that the pre-war world produced with such regularity across so many domains that it begins to feel less like paradox and more like structural feature, less like contradiction and more like the specific signature of a civilization that had organized itself to produce excellence and exploitation from the same sources at the same time, using the same institutional machinery. The hospitals that served the pre-war world's insured and employed population represented genuine peaks of medical capability. The concentration of trained personnel and sophisticated equipment and accumulated clinical knowledge, producing outcomes that would have seemed miraculous to any earlier generation and that were, by any honest measure, extraordinary achievements of organized human effort directed toward human welfare. The hospitals that served the pre-war world's uninsured and underemployed population were a different matter, understaffed and under-equipped and systematically starved of the resources that their patients needed, and that the financial architecture of the pre-war healthcare system had organized itself to direct elsewhere, toward the populations whose coverage was profitable and away from the populations whose coverage was not. The followers of the apocalypse understood this when they read the pre-war medical literature, not just the clinical literature, which they valued and preserved and taught from, but the institutional literature, the records of how the pre-war medical system had actually functioned as opposed to how it described itself as functioning. They understood that the knowledge they were preserving had been produced within a system that had systematically withheld the application of that knowledge from the populations who needed it most, and they made a deliberate institutional choice that the application of medical knowledge would not be organized around the ability to pay, would not be directed preferentially toward the comfortable, would not reproduce in the wasteland the specific injustice that the pre-war healthcare system had refined into an almost invisible institutional habit. This choice was not inevitable. It was made by specific people with specific values against the pressures of a resource-scarce environment that offered many practical reasons to abandon it. That it was made, and that it has been sustained across the generations of the followers' existence against considerable pressure from entities that would prefer the followers' capabilities to be available exclusively to those entities' own interests, is among the more genuinely hopeful things the Wasteland's institutional record contains. The pre-war pharmacological industry's relationship with the populations it nominally served was a more attenuated version of the same dynamic that characterized the medical system as a whole: the production and distribution of therapeutic compounds being organized around the production of profit in ways that meant the compounds that were most needed were not always the compounds that were most produced, and the compounds that were most produced were not always the compounds that were most needed. The gap between pharmaceutical need and pharmaceutical supply being filled by the invisible hand of a market that the pre-war world's professional economists described as self-correcting, and that the pre-war world's sick people experienced as something else entirely. Mentats and Buffout and Med-X and the other compounds that circulate through the Wasteland's pharmacopoeia are the pre-war world's pharmaceutical legacy in its most direct and most democratized form, stripped of the institutional frameworks that had governed their distribution and available to whoever has caps enough to purchase them from whoever has obtained them. The pre-war era's prescription requirements having been rendered irrelevant by the destruction of the regulatory infrastructure that had enforced them. What the Wasteland's pharmaceutical reality reveals about the pre-war world's pharmaceutical system is not that the compounds were bad, because many of them were genuinely effective at the things they were designed to do. What it reveals is that the compounds were available, that they existed and that they worked, and that their production had been technically possible throughout the pre-war period, and that the barriers to their availability had been regulatory and financial rather than scientific, had been constructed and maintained by the institutional interests that benefited from those barriers, rather than by any genuine limit on the capacity to produce or distribute them. The Wastelander who takes a Stimpack to close a wound is using technology that the pre-war world possessed, and that the pre-war world's distribution systems had directed away from the populations who most needed it toward the populations who could most profitably receive it. The Stimpak works the same way regardless of who is using it. It worked the same way in the pre-war world. The question of who had access to it was never a question about the technology. The addiction that accompanies so many of the Wasteland's pharmaceutical compounds is not a secret or an accident, but the direct consequence of the design choices that the pre-war pharmaceutical industry made with full knowledge of what those choices would produce. The same industry that had spent decades in the pre-war world developing and marketing compounds whose addictive properties were known during development and obscured during marketing. Because the addictive properties were not a flaw in the product from the industry's perspective, but a feature. The mechanism by which a customer became a guaranteed repeat purchaser and the relationship between the pharmaceutical company and its customers became not a relationship of intermittent therapeutic need, but a relationship of continuous, biological dependency. The Wasteland's chems are the pre-war world's pharmaceutical products, released from the institutional frameworks that had managed their distribution, without eliminating the addictive properties that those frameworks had been designed to make invisible rather than to address. The jet dealer in Rivet City is not more morally culpable than the pre-war pharmaceutical executive whose compounds produce the same dependency through the more respectable channel of a prescription and an insurance claim. The scale is different, the mechanism is the same. The veterans of the Sino-American War, who returned to the pre-war world with the psychological injuries that sustained combat produces, had access to a veterans' affairs system that the government had built and funded to the level that the government's other priorities permitted, which was a level considerably below what the veteran population's actual needs required, and a level that declined further with each budget cycle as the war's costs created fiscal pressure that the government's political culture resolved consistently in favor of the interests that had the most leverage over the budget process and against the interests that had the least. The terminal records of VA facilities in the capital Wasteland and elsewhere document the specific gap between the demand for services and the available resources with the bureaucratic thoroughness that institutions apply to their own inadequacies when the inadequacy is being managed rather than addressed. The records of waiting lists and deferred treatments and resource allocation decisions that reflect the math of insufficient supply against excessive demand. The soldiers who had operated the power armor, who had assaulted Chinese positions in the Alaskan winter and had conducted the occupation campaigns in the territories that the Sino-American War had brought under American military administration, returned to a country that celebrated their service in the language that pre-war America had developed for this purpose, and that provided for their needs in the way that pre-war America had developed for this purpose, which was to say incompletely, with the specific combination of genuine gratitude and institutional neglect that characterizes the treatment of the people whose sacrifices have been acknowledged in the language of national honor and not quite matched in the currency of actual support. The psychological effects of sustained combat in extreme conditions, of operations conducted in the moral ambiguity that all occupation campaigns generate, of the specific dissociation that power armor use seems to have produced in its operators. All of these went largely unaddressed in the years after the veterans returned. The VA system that was supposed to address them having been equipped with resources that reflected a political calculation about veterans' advocacy capacity, rather than a clinical assessment of veterans' therapeutic needs. The children of these veterans inherited their parents' injuries in the way that children always inherit the unaddressed wounds of the generation above them, through the daily texture of family life shaped by the psychological states that the war had produced and that the available care had not resolved. The family that appears in countless pre-war domestic spaces in the terminal record, apparently intact and apparently functional, was often carrying within it the weight of experiences that the pre-war world's public culture had celebrated and its therapeutic culture had underserved. The smiling family of the Vault-Tec advertisement, existing alongside the actual family whose interior life the advertisement had not been designed to represent. both were real. The advertisement was not a lie about the family exactly. It was a lie about what the family required, about what it carried, about the distance between the surface of pre-war domestic life and the reality that the surface was designed to cover. The places in the pre-war world where the brightness wore thin, where the institutional performance of prosperity and safety and benevolence became visibly inadequate to the reality it was supposed to cover, were not secret. They were simply not the places that the pre-war world's information systems found it useful to direct attention toward, not the places that the people who controlled the representation of the pre-war world in its own media found it profitable or politically useful to represent. The tent cities existed, and everyone who lived near them knew they existed. The addiction crisis that the pharmaceutical industry's compounds had produced existed, and the medical literature documented it. The psychological injuries of the veteran population existed, and the VA's own records documented the gap between need and provision. The environmental degradation that decades of industrial activity had produced existed, and the scientific literature described it in considerable detail. None of this was hidden. It was simply not centered, not made the subject of the sustained public attention that would have transformed it from a background condition of pre-war life into something requiring the kind of response that might have addressed it. The specific people who moved through this background, who inhabited the spaces that the bright advertisements framed as exceptional and the rest of the pre-war world framed as invisible, had the same interior complexity and the same capacity for suffering and the same basic human requirements for dignity and recognition and the social conditions that allow a person to develop and sustain a sense of their own value that everyone else in the pre-war world possessed. The terminal records they left behind when they left terminal records are the records of people navigating a world that had been organized around their relative unimportance, finding within the constraints of that world the same range of small pleasures and genuine connections and private negotiations with meaning that the terminal records of more privileged pre-war inhabitants document, because these capacities are not distributed according to the social arrangements that determine access to resources and institutional power, but are simply present in human beings as human beings, available regardless of where in the pre-war hierarchy a person happened to be located. The ghoul who walks through the wasteland carrying 2 centuries of memory is the pre-war world's most direct witness, more direct than any terminal and more direct than any holotape. A person whose consciousness spans the distance between what the pre-war world was and what the wasteland is, who remembers the brightness from inside it rather than from the evidence it left in its ruins. The ghouls who survived the initial irradiation and the 2 centuries of wasteland existence that followed are not uniform in their relationship to what they remember. The range of their responses to the question of what the pre-war world was and what was lost when it ended, being as varied as the range of their pre-war lives had been. Some of them mourn the pre-war world with a completeness and an intensity that 200 years have not moderated. The grief for the specific people and the specific places and the specific texture of daily life that the bombs destroyed, remaining as present and as particular as it was in the first years after the exchange. Some of them have arrived, across the long centuries of their unusual existence, at an assessment of the pre-war world that the passing of time and the distance it provides has made more analytical and more honest than the grief-inflected assessments of the immediately post-war period. An ability to hold both the genuine value of what was lost and the genuine culpability of what produced the losing in the same frame, without requiring either to cancel the other. Raoul Tejada, who wandered the wasteland for 2 centuries with the particular weariness of a person who had outlived everyone they had ever loved, carried within him a relationship to the pre-war world's ending that the wasteland's younger inhabitants could recognize intellectually, but not quite reach experientially. The knowledge that the people who had been alive on October 23rd had been fully formed, people with fully formed inner lives, not figures in a historical event, but specific individuals who had been making their ordinary plans for an ordinary future on an ordinary morning. being a knowledge that was theoretical for everyone who had not been there and visceral for everyone who had. His assessment of the pre-war world was not nostalgic in any simple sense. He had seen too much of it, in too many of its dimensions, to maintain the simplified Golden Age mythology that the Wasteland's younger inhabitants sometimes constructed from insufficient evidence. But he also carried with him the specific grief of a person who had lost specific people, who remembered their faces and their voices and the particular ways they had of inhabiting the world that existed nowhere in the Wasteland's ruins, which was the grief that the mythology was trying, however inadequately, to address. The super mutants who wander the Wasteland, and particularly those among them who retain sufficient cognitive function to reflect on their condition, represent a different kind of witness to the pre-war world's consequences, one that the pre-war world had not intended, but had produced through the specific combination of military research and institutional indifference that characterized its relationship to the potential consequences of its own activities. The FEV's transformation of its subjects into something the pre-war world had no category for, something that was not quite what it had been and not quite what the pre-war world had intended it to become, was not an accident in the sense of being unpredicted. The research programs that produced the FEV had documented the transformative effects on human biology with considerable thoroughness. The decision to continue those programs in the knowledge of what they produced was a decision made by people who had concluded that the military utility of the research outweighed the moral weight of what the research was doing, that the category of person being subjected to the research's effects was a category that could be treated as the research required, rather than as the people it contained were owed. Marcus, who led Broken Hills, and who reflected on the question of what super mutants were and what they were owed with a philosophical seriousness that the pre-war world had not provided for in its research protocols, was asking questions that the pre-war world's institutions had deliberately avoided asking, had structured themselves specifically not to ask, because asking them would have required treating the research subjects as the kind of entity whose answers to such questions mattered. The Wasteland had not resolved these questions. It had simply refused to suppress them, refused to maintain the institutional structures that had made the suppression possible, left them open in the way that the Wasteland left most questions open, available to be answered by whoever found themselves facing them in the specific circumstances of their own existence. The question of what was worth preserving from the pre-war world and what was worth leaving in the ruins was being answered continuously and practically by the Wasteland's communities in their daily decisions about what to salvage and what to rebuild and what to replace with something different. The medical knowledge was worth preserving. The agricultural science was worth preserving. The engineering principles that had allowed the pre-war world to build structures and systems of extraordinary sophistication were worth preserving. The propaganda apparatus that had sustained the pre-war world's self-delusion was not worth preserving and largely had not been preserved, its mechanisms too thoroughly embedded in the institutional structures that the bombs had destroyed to survive independently of those structures. The ideology that had naturalized inequality and made exploitation invisible and replaced genuine civic identity with manufactured brand loyalty had not been formally abolished, but had lost the institutional support that had made it functional, leaving in its place the messier and more honest ideologies that the Wasteland's communities developed from the available human material, without the benefit of a marketing department to make them consistent and appealing. The Brotherhood of Steel's relationship to pre-war technology was perhaps the most complicated and most revealing of the Wasteland's various approaches to the question of what to do with what the pre-war world had left behind. The Brotherhood's hoarding impulse, the systematic acquisition and restriction of pre-war technology, the conviction that only the Brotherhood was equipped to determine what applications of that technology were safe or appropriate, the willingness to use considerable force to enforce this determination against communities that might have used the technology to improve their own situations, was a response to the pre-war world's experience with unregulated technological application that had genuine logic to it, the specific logic of a group that had looked at what the pre-war world's institutional indifference to the consequences of its own technologies had produced and concluded that the correct response was the opposite extreme, that restriction and control and the concentration of technological capability in the hands of the responsible few was the answer to the irresponsibility of the many. The flaw in this logic was the same flaw that the pre-war world's power structures had exhibited in their most developed forms, which was the flaw of the self-appointed custodian, the assumption that the people making decisions about what others were allowed to have and do had both the wisdom to make those decisions correctly and the legitimacy to enforce them, regardless of the preferences of the people affected. The pre-war world's corporate and governmental structures had operated on exactly this assumption and had applied it to produce exactly the outcomes that the Brotherhood claimed to be preventing. That the Brotherhood had arrived at a position structurally identical to the one it claimed to oppose was either ironic or the most predictable thing in the Wasteland, depending on how much attention one had paid to how institutional power reliably reproduces its own logic, regardless of the ideological content with which it justifies itself. The NCR's approach to the pre-war world's legacy was different in form and equally revealing in its own way. The Republic's project of reconstructing pre-war institutional frameworks, the democratic governance, the professional military, the regulated economy, the legal system, proceeding on the assumption that what had been worth having in the pre-war world was the framework rather than the specific arrangements that the framework had been used to sustain. This assumption was not entirely wrong. The frameworks of democratic governance and rule of law and institutional accountability were genuine achievements of human political development that the Wasteland had genuine reason to want to reconstruct. The question that the NCR's development was in the process of answering when the courier arrived in the Mojave was whether it was possible to reconstruct the frameworks without also reconstructing the specific pathologies that had grown within and around those frameworks in the pre-war world, whether democracy could be built that was actually democratic, rather than a democracy-shaped structure that served the interests of the people best positioned to capture democratic institutions for private benefit. The answer the NCR was providing suggested that the reconstruction of frameworks, without the reconstruction of the conditions that made those frameworks functional, was producing something that looked like the pre-war world's institutions from a sufficient distance and that rewarded the same populations when examined more closely. The cattle barons and the water merchants and the Brahmin interests that had accumulated influence over NCR policy, occupying positions structurally equivalent to the pre-war world's corporate interests that had accumulated influence over pre-war policy. The democratic machinery functioning as advertised in the limited sense that elections occurred and ballots were counted and representatives were seated, and functioning rather less smoothly in the more important sense that the policy outputs of this democratic machinery reflected the preferences of the people who had the resources to shape those preferences rather than the preferences of the broader population the machinery nominally served. This was not a reason to abandon the attempt at democratic reconstruction. It was a reason to attend carefully to the specific mechanisms by which the pre-war world's democratic frameworks had been captured and to build, deliberately and with full awareness of the specific vulnerabilities involved, the countermeasures that the pre-war world had either not built or had progressively dismantled over the decades of corporate consolidation that had preceded the war. The Wasteland offered what the pre-war world had not offered, which was the opportunity to build these countermeasures from the beginning rather than to retrofit them into an established system whose existing beneficiaries had every incentive to prevent the retrofitting. Whether this opportunity would be used was, at the time the courier walked through the Mojave, genuinely undetermined. the question being answered by the specific choices of specific people in specific circumstances, rather than by any structural inevitability pointing in either direction. The children, growing up in the Wasteland's functional communities in Diamond City and Good Springs, and the Mojave's scattered settlements and the NCR's established towns, were growing up in a world that had not yet decided what it would become, in communities that were answers in progress to questions the pre-war world had foreclosed, in the specific uncertainty of a civilization in the process of construction, rather than the comfortable weight of a civilization whose construction was complete and whose foundational decisions were, for the people living within it, simply the conditions of existence. This uncertainty was not comfortable. Children in the Wasteland grew up faster and with more direct exposure to the realities of danger and scarcity and the violent resolution of disputes than children in the pre-war suburbs had been expected to confront. The protection from these realities that pre-war parenting culture had prized being simply unavailable in environments that could not sustain it. But the children of the Wasteland grew up knowing that the world they inhabited was the world that human choices had produced, and that human choices were continuing to produce, that the settlement they lived in had been built by people they knew, and that what it would become was not predetermined, but depended on the choices that would be made by the people who continued to build it, including themselves. This knowledge, available to the Wasteland's children in ways it had not been available to the pre-war world's children, who had been formed by an education system specifically designed to produce a different understanding, was the knowledge that the pre-war world's brightness had cost the most to suppress, and that the bombs had made impossible to suppress any longer. The world was made by choices. The choices could be different. The people who made them were not the inevitable products of institutional forces beyond their reach, but agents whose agency was real and consequential, and whose decisions would actually determine what the future looked like, rather than performing the ratification of decisions already made elsewhere by people with more power and less accountability. This was not a comfortable knowledge, and it did not produce comfortable children, but comfort had never been the Wasteland's promise. The promise, such as it was honesty, the specific honesty of a world that could no longer afford to maintain the machinery of its own self-deception, and that had consequently stopped trying, that had laid its foundations bare in the rubble of everything that had been built on top of them, and left the next generation to see them clearly and decide, with full knowledge of what they were, what to build from them. So the Wasteland continued, as it had been continuing for 200 years, and as it would continue for as long as there were people in it to sustain the continuation, the slow and painful and genuinely uncertain work of building something from the ruins of what had been lost, something that might eventually be worth calling civilization in the sense that the word had always promised rather than in the sense the pre-war world had delivered, something that honored the genuine achievements of what had been without replicating the specific cruelties that had accompanied those achievements, something that the people building it had actually chosen rather than inherited from a past whose choices had been made for them. The brightness was gone, and the silence that had replaced it was slowly filling with the sounds of people doing the hard, ordinary work of staying alive and trying. In the margin between surviving and dying that the Wasteland sometimes permitted to build something better, the cursor blinked in the empty rooms. The screens still glowed with the words of the people who had written before the fire. And outside, in the irradiated air of a world that was still, against all the evidence of October 23rd, persisting, the living made their choices and lived with them, and handed the world they had made forward to the people who would follow them, imperfect and incomplete, and genuinely, stubbornly, defiantly present. So rest now, wanderer, with the ruins settling around you and the stars overhead unchanged by everything that has happened beneath them. The world that ended on October 23rd, 2077, was not the golden age that the grief of its survivors sometimes made it seem. It was a civilization of genuine wonder and deliberate blindness, of real achievement and systematic cruelty, of brightness manufactured and sustained at the cost of the honesty that might have saved it. The wasteland that replaced it is not better in the sense of being more comfortable or more safe or more abundant in the things that comfortable and safe and abundant civilizations provide. It is better in the sense of being more honest about what it is and what it costs and who it serves and what the people in it have actually chosen rather than what has been chosen for them. That honesty is not nothing. In the long accounting of what the pre-war world was and what it left behind, it may be the most valuable inheritance the ruins contain, the thing most worth protecting in the hard work of building something new from the ashes of what was lost. The bombs fell and the brightness ended, and what remained was people, which had always been the most important thing, and which the pre-war world, for all its extraordinary effort, had never quite managed to make central to its purpose. Sleep now. The road ahead is long, and the wasteland is wide, and the future is, at last, genuinely open. That is not nothing. That may be everything.